And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Not all silences are voids. Some are filled with stalled momentum, with lost beginnings, with the weight of futures deferred. Beneath the noise of policy and platform, something ancient has slowed, the movement toward what does not yet exist. This is not a collapse, but a pause so long it begins to resemble permanence. In the distance, a blueprint curls inward. The cranes have stopped. The plans are waiting, not for permission, but for memory. This is where we listen. No war, no collapse, no catastrophe stopped the future. It was simply never started. Across the wealthiest cities in history, cranes stand still, rail lines remain unfinished, and the public imagination has stalled. It is not poverty that defines this moment, but paralysis. A civilization surrounded by tools, capital and knowledge, yet unable to move. We speak often of crisis, but less of its inverse. The quiet erosion of belief that anything better is still possible. Hannah Arendt once described the political condition as the space where beginnings occur. The human capacity for natality. But when that capacity is replaced by proceduralism, when risk becomes the highest moral concern, imagination withers. What remains is administration without direction, critique without construction, a society that performs intelligence while abandoning initiative. Walter Benjamin's Angel of History looked backward at accumulating wreckage. This moment offers something stranger, an age staring forward into stillness, where nothing has yet been built. Imagination, in its political form, is the applied capacity to envision and construct shared futures. It is not escapism, but engagement, a way of proposing what the present might yet become. Its absence is not felt through noise, but through drift, the kind of drift that produces delay without deliberation, policy without movement, structure without change. To name this failure is not simply to critique. It is to make visible a form of forgetting, and in that recognition lies a choice, not whether we can begin again, but whether we remember how. There was a time, not long ago, when ambition was embedded in institutions, when governments acted not only to regulate, but to initiate, when universities expanded not scarcity, but access, when the public sphere was measured in what it dared to construct. The 20th century, for all its flaws, held a simple confidence that the future was something one could build. And so it did, imperfectly, unevenly, but undeniably. John Dewey spoke of democracy as a mode of associated living, one that required institutions to function not as inert bureaucracies, but as experiments in shared possibility. That spirit animated a generation of builders, of systems, of infrastructures, of ideas. In California, a single state built what became the world's most respected public university network. Housing boomed to meet migration, highways, aqueducts, energy grids, all material expressions of belief in a future that included others. Contrast that with today. Universities are more exclusive, housing is more restricted, infrastructure is stalled by process. The civic muscle that once made these things feel routine now strains to repaint a school. Antonio Gramsci called it a morbid interregnum, a moment when the old world is dying and the new cannot be born. That is our institutional atmosphere, not broken, but inert. Not collapsed, but adrift. This is not to romanticize the past. It carried injustice alongside ambition, but its legacy included the instinct to act, to initiate structures meant to last. That instinct has faded. The ability to imagine public transformation has withered into project management. Bureaucracy survives. Desire does not. And so the past stands not as a model to imitate, but as evidence of what is structurally possible, when a society still believes that its institutions can do more than preserve what is. Scarcity is the story we tell to justify stillness, but it no longer describes the material world. We live amidst unprecedented wealth, technology and knowledge, more than enough to house, educate and sustain entire populations with dignity. Yet we behave as if constrained by lack. The absence is not of means, but of mobilization. What is scarce is not material, it is momentum. Herbert Marcuse warned of repressive abundance, a society flooded with consumer goods while deprived of emancipatory possibility. This is our condition. Flat-screen televisions abound, childcare is inaccessible, smartphones multiply, housing permits stall. The tools for life are available, but the systems that enable living are choked by friction, delay and design. Amartya Sen's distinction between goods and capabilities is crucial here. Abundance in things does not guarantee freedom in practice. Scarcity persists, but selectively it appears in the places least profitable to fix. Affordable housing is scarce, but luxury real estate blooms. Public transit is underbuilt, while ride-sharing apps proliferate. This is not a natural equilibrium. It is the architecture of a political economy that rewards consumption over construction, circulation over foundation. The myth of scarcity, then, is not a misreading. It is a management tool, one that rationalizes the absence of action. If the world cannot be built, no one is to blame. But if it can, and we simply haven't, then the failure becomes moral. The conditions exist, the future could begin. The only thing missing is the decision to make it so. Modern liberalism finds itself trapped in a paradox. It remains rhetorically committed to progress, yet structurally averse to action. It is animated by ideals, but paralyzed by procedures. It speaks of justice, yet fears the messiness of making. In the name of equity, it hesitates. In the name of inclusion, it defers. The result is not conservatism, but drift, a politics of aspiration without architecture. Max Weber foresaw this dilemma in his image of the iron cage, a rationalized system so obsessed with regulation and efficiency that it forgets its ends. Today, that cage has thickened. Institutions speak in the grammar of risk, liability, compliance, stakeholder management, but what they manage is not danger, it is uncertainty, discomfort, dissent. Charles Taylor's warning that procedural liberalism would eventually hollow out moral substance echoes here. Without a shared telos, governance becomes a loop, process in service of process. Michael Sandel's critique lands with force. A liberalism that cannot define the good cannot defend it. And so politics reduces to harm mitigation rather than transformation. The goal becomes to avoid failure, not pursue success, to minimize offense, not maximize possibility. Decision-making collapses into delay. Imagination becomes dangerous because it implies commitment, action, risk. This is not a call for authoritarian boldness or romanticized state power. It is a call for moral clarity, for a politics that understands that equity without construction is a contradiction, that ideals require material form, that the desire to build is not in tension with justice, it is its realization. Without that clarity, liberalism becomes managerial, ethical, careful, and in doing so it abandons its role as a force for collective creation. The future remains administratively possible, but philosophically unclaimed. Institutions once translated imagination into form. They gathered attention, resources, and legitimacy to act on behalf of the future. Universities expanded access to knowledge. Governments built physical and social infrastructure. Foundations launched enduring civic projects. These were not just service providers, they were engines of world-making. But over time, the machinery slowed. The logic shifted, the capacity remained, the desire did not. Ivan Illich warned that institutions, when detached from their original purpose, begin to invert their function. Schools limit learning, hospitals produce dependency, bureaucracies entrench delay. Bell Hooks saw a similar erosion, a shift from education as liberation to education as filtration. Today, universities serve less as public goods than prestige economies. They offer excellence but not expansion. Research persists, access retreats, governments fare little better. The tools of transformation, funding, authority, mandate remain intact, but action stalls under procedural weight. Projects are reviewed, contested, revised into inertia. Agencies duplicate efforts, permits expire. The state becomes self-cancelling, not by intent, but through recursive caution. Cornel West's call for prophetic institutions, bold, imaginative, justice-driven, finds few contemporary echoes. Even philanthropy, once the builder of libraries and public institutions, has largely retreated into platforms, metrics, and short-cycle interventions. The long arc of institution building, planning for decades, not quarters, has been replaced by brand alignment and innovation theatre. The habit of founding, of creating structures that reshape civic life, is fading. None of this is collapse. It is entropy. Institutions do not die. They drift into irrelevance. They continue to operate technically alive, but no longer oriented toward the future. What's missing is not capacity, but conviction. The belief that durable shared structures are still worth imagining into being. Without that, even the best funded systems will produce only repetition, not renewal. Power now lives in attention. not in armies or ballots alone, but in the ability to shape what people see, think, and forget. In an age of algorithmic saturation, the imagination is not censored, it is redirected, flooded, filtered. The result is not a lack of content, but a scarcity of coherence. What cannot be held in sustained focus cannot be built. Byung-Chul Han describes this condition as infocracy, a regime where control is exerted not through force, but through the dispersion of meaning. Shoshana Zuboff, too, names it surveillance capitalism, a system that commodifies human experience into behavioral predictions. Together they diagnose a deeper shift. We are not just distracted, we are administered, curated, tracked. Our attention is optimized away from complexity toward frictionless consumption. This has consequences. Imagination is not born in isolation. It requires shared reference, narrative time, silence. But silence is now rare. The feed refreshes endlessly. Urgency displaces inquiry. News cycles collapse into gesture. Even activism, when filtered through these platforms, risks becoming reactive performance, unable to hold attention long enough to nurture alternatives. The attention economy does not merely scatter focus. It reorders what is thinkable. It makes smallness feel wise and scale feel naive. It trains skepticism towards structure and awe towards spectacle. It privileges critique that can be captured in a clip, and so serious ideas, complex, slow, communal, struggle to surface, let alone endure. What is lost is not just concentration, it is imaginative range, the shared capacity to think beyond the immediate, the popular, the monetizable. In this sense, attention is not neutral. It is a battleground for what futures are visible and which remain unimagined. And without reclaiming that space or creating new spaces outside of it, no architecture of renewal can begin. There is a mood beneath the discourse, not loud but heavy, a quiet despair that does not protest because it no longer believes protest will matter. Among the young, it appears in stalled transitions, education that no longer guarantees entry, work that cannot afford permanence, cities that sparkle but do not welcome. The dream of progress has not exploded, it has dimmed. What remains is management, survival, and irony. Mark Fisher called this capitalist realism, the inability to imagine a world beyond the current one. Lauren Berlant named it cruel optimism, the attachment to dreams that systematically betray those who hold them. These frameworks do not merely describe policy failure, they describe emotional texture, the thinning of hope, the exhaustion of alternatives, the quiet recoil from ambition. The generational image is simple and devastating. A 28-year-old, back in her childhood room, employed, educated, and stranded. She scrolls housing listings in cities her salary cannot touch. She watches institutions debate inclusion but not expansion. She hears calls to dream but sees no scaffolding to support belief. Her condition is not radical, it is ordinary. This is not disaffection, it is disenchantment. The sense that structural pathways to stability, to meaning, to contribution have been blocked not by catastrophe but by design, and so irony becomes armour, politics becomes content. The future becomes ambient, felt, feared, but never entered. Yet beneath even this something stirs, not as optimism but as ache, a longing for rootedness, for purpose beyond performance, for a civic life that is not just observed but built. What's missing is not knowledge or will. It is the collective signal that imagining something better is not naive, that it might even be necessary. To imagine is to remember that the present is not inevitable, that what exists was made and could be made otherwise. Ernst Bloch called this the principle of hope, not as fantasy, but as method. Imagination in this sense is political. It sketches what does not yet exist in order to make it actionable. It gives form to desire. It dares to specify. Paulo Freire called this conscientiação, the awakening of critical consciousness through which people recognise their capacity to intervene in reality. David Graeber reminded us that every system is contingent, that history is full of alternatives, that utopia is not a destination but a refusal to accept the given as all that can be. In their hands, imagination is not escapism, it is demand. This kind of imagination is infrastructural. It builds not only in dream, but in deed, in zoning laws and school designs, in budgets and ballot measures. It asks, what would it take to live differently together? And then it starts, not from purity, but from plausibility, from what can be risked now to open what might come next. To rebuild imagination is not to restore innocence, it is to cultivate a public practice, to name the world honestly and still believe in its reformation. That means reclaiming institutional courage. It means forming new rhythms of civic gathering. It means resisting the privatization of vision, the belief that one must wait alone for permission to begin. What's required is not utopia, but fidelity, to the belief that another configuration of life remains possible and worth attempting. Such fidelity is not naive, it is disciplined, and in a time of drift, it becomes a form of resistance, to act as if the future could still be shared, and then to start making it so. The future does not knock, it waits. In shelves of forgotten plans, in folders never reopened, in projects paused mid-sentence, it waits in city archives, in community drafts, in dreams mumbled once, in meetings then abandoned. These are not artifacts of failure, they are the residue of belief, left behind when momentum faltered, when attention shifted, when the weather of the world turned skeptical. Simone Weil spoke of attention as the purest form of generosity. To attend to the possible, not just the urgent, is a civic act. Merleau-Ponty reminded us that not all structures are visible. That meaning hides in habits, in silence, in gesture. The blueprint, then, is not lost. It is embedded in cultural muscle memory, in half-forgotten precedents, in the soft logic of the doable. And so to begin is not to invent. It is to perceive, to name the dormant, to lift what still rests beneath cynicism and drift. The act itself need not be grand. A home approved, a law revised, a commons revived. Small moves but directional, each an assertion that the future is not closed, each a quiet defiance of delay. No manifesto is needed, no sweeping call, only a shift from observation to initiation, a re-entry into the unfinished. The courage to treat possibility as something worth unfolding. Not all truths arrive as prophecy, some return as memory, and so the final gesture is not an answer, but a recognition. The failure was never total. The blueprint still waits, folded quietly in reach. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform